Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's webinar entitled, Is There a Day After? The Future of Post-War Gaza. I'm Khaled El-Gindi, Director of MEI's Palestine program, and I'm very pleased to moderate today's discussion. Almost a full year since Israel launched its unprecedented assault on Gaza following Hamas's attack of October 7th, the war has taken a massive human, material, and psychological toll on Gaza's 2.3 million people, with at least 41,000 dead, including at least 16,000 children, most of Gaza's physical landscape reduced to rubble, and massive individual and collective trauma that will last for generations to come. Today, we're going to look at the question of what post-war Gaza may look like, the so-called day after, to see what will or should come next. To help us better understand the issue, we've put together a veritable dream team of experts. I'll introduce them briefly here, but you can check out their full bios on the event page for today's panel. First, we have Tahani Mustafa, Senior Analyst for Palestine with the International Crisis Group, joining us from Amman, Jordan. Next, we have Joe Saba, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the American Near East Refugee Aid, ANIRA, which is one of the main humanitarian groups working inside Gaza. And Joe is also a former World Bank country director for the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Next, we have Mohammed Samhouri, a Palestinian economist from Gaza, an academic, and a former senior economic advisor to the Palestinian Authority at a very critical moment. In fact, Mohammed worked on the Gaza disengagement about 19 years ago, and he is joining us from Cairo. Last and certainly not least, Mohammed Shahade, who is Chief of Programs and Communications at Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, also from Gaza, and joining us from Copenhagen. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The format for today's session will be a moderated Q&A. I'll start off the discussion with a couple rounds of questions to our panelists, but we also welcome your questions as audience members. You can submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can submit them at any time during the webinar, and I will try to incorporate them into our discussion. Also, keep an eye on the chat box for panelists' social media handles and links to articles and other resources related to today's discussion. Finally, please note that we are recording this webinar, so if you miss any part of it, or if you have to leave early, or if you just want to share with everyone, you can always come back and check that out on the webpage for this event. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. Mohammed Samhouri, I would like to start with you as the person who oversaw the Gaza disengagement on behalf of the PA, and this is actually where we first met in 2005. In many ways, the Gaza disengagement was the original sin for how we got to where things are today. So if you could give us your assessment of why that process failed and how those failures brought us to where we are now.
Thank you, Khaled. Before I answer your question, let me make quick 2 points. One is related to my actual role in this engagement, and two, regarding the question of why Israel actually disengaged from Gaza. With respect to my role, I remember I was approached 6 months before Israel left Gaza by a senior Palestinian official and asked me to form a team of technical experts in all fields of related to the economy, infrastructure, borders, everything. And I did manage to form that team, about 40 technical experts. And for 6 months, we managed to have a plan to prepare Gaza for the day after. We consulted with the private sector, we consulted with the NGOs, We even presented our work periodically to the political factions in Gaza. We consulted with the donor community. We worked closely with James Wolfenson, who was appointed by the quartet as a special envoy for disengagement. So we continue to work on preparing Gaza for the day after until Israel evacuated Gaza on the early morning hours of September 12, 2005. So that's actually my role in that file, basically coordinating the efforts of the 40 technical experts in order to do the job that we were tasked to do. As to why Israel left Gaza, the way I see it, Israel really never had long-term prospects of staying in Gaza. Neither the geography nor the demography of the place would allow Israel to control 30% of Gaza. So sooner or later, the way I see it, Israel has to leave. It was just a matter of when and at what price. Two things Israel wanted from this engagement. One is to freeze the political process, and the famous Haaretz interview with Dov Weizeklas mentioned this explicitly, that we need to freeze this peace process. And two, to consolidate its presence in the West Bank. Almost 2 decades later, it seems that Israel has managed to achieve both objectives. And Gaza, to turn now to your question, is where it is now. So why this engagement failed? 4 factors actually, in my view, explain that failure. One, the disengagement was a unilateral act, a one-sided act. It was never coordinated with the PA, and it was basically an act that Israel did for its own strategic interest, as I mentioned. Had it been part of a political process that was coordinated with the PA might have gotten a credit for its act, and Gaza might have seen a different future than the future that it has been through, or the catastrophe that we are witnessing now. So this is the first factor. It was a unilateral act devoid of any political aspects. 2, the disengagement was not a complete one, meaning that while Israel has evacuated Gaza from its settlers and military forces, it continued to have overall control over Gaza. Territorial waters, population registry, airspace, electromagnetic space, exit and entry points for people and goods, except maybe Rafah crossing. And according to the agreement, movement and access agreement that was signed in November 2005 between the PA and Israel, brokered by the US, Rafah border crossing was under the Palestinian management in the presence of European mission. But Israel at that time has a real life view of what is happening, real-time view of what is happening in that crossing. So this is number 2, that while Israel has evacuated the interior of Gaza, the whole strip was still under the overall security control of Israel. Number 3, the international approach to Gaza was non-political. Donors or the international community only provided what they think would benefit Gaza economically. So we have a list of projects in order to provide some economic dividends to the population of Gaza, with no political effort on the part of the international community to link the Israeli exit from Gaza. I use exit loosely here, with the overall political process. That was not enough for the disengagement to succeed. And number four, there is the Hamas factor, or the unexpected political change in the Palestinian arena, when Hamas, the way Hamas perceived disengagement as intisar al-muqawama, or the victory of the resistance. They have, in their view, have liberated Gaza. So what they did, they wanted to capitalize on their perceived achievement. So they took part of the elections, legislative elections of January 2006, and surprisingly, they won. The reaction of the international community and that of Israel was not positive, was not welcoming to the change. So Hamas-led government was boycotted, and the tension started to build up between Fatah and Hamas, leading to the armed clashes between the two sides, and ending up with Hamas takeover of Gaza in mid-2007. That's what happened in Gaza in mid-2007. Three things followed Hamas takeover of Gaza, and I will be quick to finish. One, the Palestinian internal political division, and two, the Israeli blockade over Gaza, and three, the frequent Israeli military campaigns that devastated Gaza, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, and then the one that we have been through for the past 12 months. So this is how disengagement and the implications of what happened over the past 19 years brought Gaza to where it is now. To answer your question.
Thank you, Mohammed. Joe, I'd like to turn to you. You just came back from a visit to the region in your capacity as chair of ANERA. Give us a sense of what you saw and heard, especially as it relates to the scale of the human and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. What are the immediate needs and actual provisions in Gaza? What can you tell us about Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law throughout the past 12 months, especially as it relates to issues like deconfliction, where humanitarian groups coordinate with Israel, with Israel's military in order to allow the safe delivery of aid. This has been a repeated problem throughout the last 12 months, and many hundreds actually of aid workers have been killed. So if you could give us a general sense of how you see the situation on the ground.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me with you. I did recently return from a trip primarily to the northern West Bank, to Jerusalem, to Jordan. We had intended to go to Gaza, but just as we were leaving, a convoy, an ANERA convoy, taking medical goods and supplies to a field hospital in Rafah, found itself attacked. The subcontract, we had a contractor, ANERA had a contractor which provided the logistics, and the first car of that convoy was attacked by the Israelis, and 4 young men in that car were killed. Following that event, we were advised it would be unsafe probably for some of us to go in. So we deferred our trip to Gaza, that we're currently planning again. And I'll come back to that incident because it's central to your question. You asked generally about the humanitarian situation. There's been quite a bit out there put out by the United Nations. Part of my trip was to confer with ANERA's staff Since October 7th, we've done about $100 million in value of goods in West Bank, but primarily in Gaza, mostly food, medical supplies, and several other things like small solar panels, reverse osmosis. The situation on the ground from our staff, from our daily contact, is really quite acute. We see at least 500,000 people on the brink of starvation. We see, particularly among children, and particularly among the youngest children, acute malnutrition, stunting. We see a lot of debilitating diarrhea, and with that, frankly, the spread of infectious diseases. We see that 90% of the people roughly are displaced, or if they have a shelter of their own, they've taken in so many people that their own shelter is becoming almost uninhabitable. We've seen the destruction of most of the utilities, sanitation, electricity, roads, etc. And of course, we know that roughly 625,000 children who missed 1 year of school are about to miss another. So the situation is really catastrophic. Yesterday's New York Times on the West Bank had an excellent article, and we witnessed a great deal of what that article points out in terms of the northern part. But just to come back to my last point on Gaza, you asked about what is required. Before October 7th, over 500 trucks a day came in providing supplies. Our staff counted the trucks from September 1 to 15, only 67 trucks a day came in. The number of trucks per day over the last 2 weeks has increased a bit, but we looked at a pattern since October 7th. What we see in the pattern is that maybe we have an average of 160 over that whole period. It is sufficient to prevent death by mass starvation, but it is certainly not sufficient. It's very well controlled if you look at the overall pattern to avoid perhaps massive death, but not to avoid this critical starvation, this wasting, malnutrition, and disease and suffering. And just this morning, before this webinar, I was online because what we're seeing when a community over the course of a year has been so deprived and faced with such humanitarian crisis, and when supplies are restricted to a trickle, they begin to turn in on each other. So we have had, and other humanitarians have had, our trucks attacked, looted. We have had difficulties with different communities in Gaza asking, why do we give to one tent hospital and not another? This is quite natural, but it is also alarming. Turning to the West Bank, I'll come to, as I said, there was an excellent article yesterday in the New York Times looking at the destruction. In the 30 years I've traveled in the West Bank, and I do it often, I have never seen the situation as bad as I saw. The number of throw-up checkpoints. Contract employees are being used by Israel at these points. They have no respect for any passport, for any humanitarians. Their purpose seems to be to restrict all movement and to keep people within their villages. We saw massive expansion of settlements. And with those settlements, a new aggressive approach by settlers who have attacked Palestinian farmers, persons, houses, and crops, essentially with impunity. So this destruction and the wanton destruction of utilities, I saw, for example, in several places in the Northwest Bank, where these armored bulldozers have come in and others have come in. They have cut the electricity, they smashed the sewers, they smashed the drinking water pipes, and they have smashed through, the streets where all the shops are clustered, and also destroying lots of cars, many of which are taxis. These provide livelihoods to people who are already economically vulnerable. Once these things have been destroyed, we talked to many of the village leaders and many of the people there. It's a very sad story. And that is a broad wanton destruction. On deconfliction, we did meet with Israeli military in Tel Aviv. We met with COGOT, which arranges coordination for Gaza. I have to say, over time, since October 7th, we've had a civil conversation with them. They have been of assistance in many, many cases. Many of their people have acted, I think, I see, in good faith. But I have to point out also that, as they pointed out, they report to their superiors within the military. And there are times when, as they put it, there are policies and sensitivities which often block the admission of certain goods and of trucks or of quantities of trucks. We can get into that. And I did, when you come to the international humanitarian law, come back to my original point, those 4 men who were killed in the convoy. I brought that up, as well as another employee of Benaira was killed, and one that's still imprisoned in the Negev, of which we know nothing. I pointed all this out, and I pointed out that these attacks have a chilling effect on the humanitarian community. The omnipresent violence, the drones followed by lethal attacks, create obviously a physical insecurity. I pointed out that those 4 men, even if they were armed, were of no danger to the convoy, no proven danger to the IDF, and yet they were killed. The convoy did reach the hospital. I raised with them clearly the issue of the protocols to the Geneva Convention of 1949, which Israel signed, because I think it's important to point this out. And it's relevant also to the countries which provide aid to Israel, particularly military aid. And in particular, Articles 15, 79, 76, 77, which provide protection for women, children, civilian medical personnel, and protection for journalists. 51 and 54 outlaw attacks on civilian population and destruction of food, water, and other materials needed for survival. In response to that, they argued that they viewed their attacks on those 4 men and other such attacks as, and the word they kept using was legitimate. They have a different interpretation. That said, of course, we have to move on in our conversations, and I have to say, we did have constructive. So you go back and forth on all of this. The question of international humanitarian law was brought up in our meetings, both with the American ambassador, but also with Mohammed Mustafa and Wael Zakut at the Palestinian Authority. We understand that quite a number of legal scholars, both with international humanitarian organizations, as well as within administrations in Europe and the United States, have briefed these matters quite well. And I looked at one such brief. I'm afraid, and I conclude, I'm afraid to say, in my personal opinion, those briefs have fallen on deaf ears.
Thank you, Joe. It's a very, very dire picture that you painted. Tahani, I'd like to pick up on the point that Joe was just making. Very recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, recently published a pretty shocking report in which he says, and I quote, "Never in post-war history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely as was the case for the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza." Meanwhile, groups like Human Rights Watch and Israeli group B'Tselem, Save the Children, the World Food Program, have all come to the conclusion that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. We now know, thanks to a report from 2 days ago, that the State Department Bureau for Refugees and Migration, as well as USAID, came to that same conclusion, even though Secretary of State Blinken officially declared that Israel was in compliance, was not restricting international law. The experts within the US government have found the opposite. So given this reality, where it seems pretty clear that Israel is deliberately using starvation as a weapon, what has the international community done to push back on these Israeli restrictions and policies? And what should they do?
Thanks, Khaled. Well, I mean, I think Joe did a pretty good job in terms of painting the kind of dire picture that we have on the ground. And as you said, all of the impartial sources of information we have, the UN, international aid agencies, and even the US State Department itself has had their own kind of internal agencies confirm this, or confirm this picture. You know, we've had experienced aid workers that have said that what we're seeing now in Gaza is by far the worst devastation ever to be seen in a context like this. In modern day history. You know, they've never seen a situation this bad. In most wars or natural disasters, people have the ability to leave. In Gaza, they're trapped while Israel continues its military action and severely restricts access to food, medicine, and other humanitarian aid, despite Israel claiming, on the contrary, to be allowing sufficient amounts of aid in. You know, but you still have a large proportion of the Gazan population now that are suffering from chronic infections, illnesses due to a lack of sanitation, food and medicine. Humanitarian infrastructure is non-existent because Israel won't allow for the population to settle anywhere, even in safe zones, as well as the fact that they're now, as we've seen and as Joe detailed, you know, they are systematically targeting aid workers and shelters. So, you know, we have seen that there are a lot of countries around the world where we've seen the kind of change or shift in popular opinion and support for the Palestinian cause. You know, we can look at things like the recent vote in the UN General Assembly against the Israeli occupation of the occupied territories. But ultimately, countries that do have the most leverage, like the US, especially with its veto, which we've seen it leverage time and time again in Israel's favor, especially since the latest onslaught since the 7th of October. The UK, other European countries like France, Germany, that have repeatedly acted to block action, have continued to support Israel logistically and economically. So what much of the international community have done and said is little more than sticking plasters at this point, I think, to mask the lack of political action. You know, we've seen things like airdrops, trying to sort of find solutions around the fact that Israel has completely closed off all land crossings that really are the only viable routes to allow sufficient amounts of aid in. You know, so other than airdrops, I mean, we've also seen the use of sea, you know, that have been proven to be completely inefficient in terms of cost. Obviously haven't even allowed a fraction of the amount of aid that has needed to go in. And what's worse is that these substitutes to land crossings that the international community have tried to deploy have actually cost Palestinian lives. You know, we've actively seen Palestinians drown in the sea trying to get hold of aid, or aid literally dropping on top of those beneficiaries, right? But what it all amounts to is poor substitutes for pressuring or refusing to put the pressure on Israel to open those land crossings. I mean, even regional states have not tried to leverage any of their normalization deals, which, by the way, are not zero-sum games. You know, it's not really a one-way thing. Israel is equally dependent on regional states, as regional states are dependent on Israel. But none of that has really been leveraged to exert any pressure here. If anything, regional states like Jordan, like Egypt, like the Gulf states have also been equally complicit in providing the logistical, economic security, and to some degree, even the diplomatic cover for what has happened since the 7th of October. You know, they are indulging in similar practices, and worse yet, they're now having to sort of play a delicate PR game where, on the one hand, their policies are not really gelling with the popular sentiment at home, nor the kind of rhetoric that they're trying to peddle to their populations in terms of the logic of their foreign policy. You know, that kind of schism is not lost on their populations. But ultimately, what it comes down to is the absolute absence of pressure. But we have, you know, in the past where we have seen it, where the US has been able to restrain Israel, you know, we can think back to examples like Beirut in 1982, the first Gulf War. You know, these are instances where the US has really been able to rein Israel back in, and we just haven't seen that at
Thanks, Tahani. Hamad Shahadi, I want to come to you and talk about, it's now been nearly 4 months since President Biden put forward a 3-phase ceasefire for hostage proposal that supposedly has been accepted by the sides, although the details haven't been fully worked out. And time and again, we heard from the administration that we were just on the verge of reaching that deal. And yet it hasn't happened. And today it seems like US officials have all but conceded that there's not going to be a ceasefire deal anytime in the near future. And now we've seen also the expansion of this war into Lebanon as well. According to the administration, Israel is fully on board with the current deal, and only Hamas is the obstacle, despite the fact that Israel has put up new conditions by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And we've even seen some in his own cabinet accusing him, the Prime Minister, of being the primary obstacle. So what is your assessment of where things stand for a ceasefire deal, and what are the major obstacles to getting it done?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much, Khaled. And I'm here mostly for the questions, so please shoot those as much as you want. Feel free to ask any questions without any sensitivities. Basically, in terms of the negotiations, I got fed up at some point of this sort of gaslighting. So I went and spoke with actually the people that are involved, that sit around the table and negotiate with some of them. And I've been privileged to gain such access and get some of their time and learn what exactly is happening. As you said, Biden put a deal on the table that is basically an Israeli deal. It was formulated by the Israeli negotiating delegations, the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli general in charge of the negotiations, or the hostages file. And they came to Netanyahu and said, this is the deal, the best that we can get. Netanyahu disagreed and rejected it and said, you don't know how to negotiate. So Biden took it and put it on the table and said, here is an Israeli deal that Israel has agreed to. Now we wait for Hamas's answer. Hamas, it took them some time to get some clarifications. It was basically about the ambiguity of the language that would allow Israel to go back to the war again, to fighting in Gaza, pulverizing Gaza after 6 weeks. So what Hamas asked for was, I'm happy to go through the wording of the changes, but it was 3 very slight amendment to the text that was on July 2nd, in which they said, we accept the text on the condition that in the second stage, that there will be a second stage to begin with, and in that second stage, the war is going to end. This genocidal campaign on Gaza is not going to last. That is the very basic demand. A ceasefire means cessation of hostilities, not a pause for 6 weeks and then go on. Once Hamas accepted, Netanyahu escalated the sabotage of the negotiations. So he put, as you said, the 4 conditions on the table that are impossible to accept for anyone. He put even more than these 4, but the 4 were basically Israel stays in Gaza indefinitely in the Philadelphia corridor, and the second condition, the Netzarim corridor, that cuts Gaza in 2. So not allowing people to go back to the northern half of Gaza and leaving about 1 million people stranded in these 10 cities in the south, out in the open. The third condition was something about demanding a list of the names of every living hostage in Gaza, which Hamas says we cannot collect unless there is quiet on the ground for us to move around and go and make such a list and see who's living and who's dead. And then he asked for 40 living hostages to be released in the first phase instead of 33 dead and alive. And in that 40 count, he gave Hamas even a list of the names, which included many Israeli soldiers, something that was very explicitly delayed to the second stage of the negotiations. So he basically took a sledgehammer to the Biden initiative, particularly the Biden or the article on the withdrawal of Israel eastwards in the first phase. They were supposed to withdraw gradually from the Netzarim and Philadelphia to the buffer zone that they created, which is 1 kilometer deep all over the east of Gaza, and stay there until the second phase. Now, Netanyahu also went to assassinate Hamas leaders, but Hamas said this is not going to impede or obstruct the negotiations. We consider that this is a war happening, and if you get an opportunity to kill one of our leaders, go ahead. If it's the other way, we could have done it. So this is an act of war. It's not something that would blow off or derail the negotiations. The US came to that table with that understanding. Okay, Hamas accepted our deal, Israel didn't. How do you allow the DNC Kamala Harris's appointment or nomination to go undisturbed. That was basically the thing that I was told, literally. How do you allow it to go undisturbed? And how do you prevent Iran and Hezbollah from retaliating against the assassination of Fuad Shukr and Ismail Haniyeh? So they came to the negotiating table and took Israel's position blindly. Not 100%, but 99.99. So basically they said, okay, we embrace all of Netanyahu's conditions, but we give Hamas a concession that Israel held previously a veto over 100 names of the 300 heavily sentenced Palestinian detainees and prisoners. We're going to lower that veto to 65 instead of 100. That was basically it. Other than that, the war goes on as soon as the 6 weeks are over. It gives Netanyahu leeway to jump back and continue the fighting. And they understood that Hamas would not in any way accept such a deal. They were very clear that a ceasefire means an actual ceasefire. So they insisted on the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the US themselves, to issue, as you said, positive statements that say we are on the verge of a breakthrough. There is a breakthrough right around the corner. And you see these becoming repetitive. And Israel and the mediators objected to these. They said this does not represent what's actually happening. But the Americans were very persistent on that. It was under the pretext that this false hope can generate some pressure on Netanyahu to make compromises. But the actual rationale was, let's sort of bind the hands of Hezbollah and Iran and buy time so that Kamala Harris's DNC would go undisturbed. Once that show is over, you see now the clear admission of this is not going anywhere, which ties to the other question that you asked. How do you pressure Netanyahu to actually, or how do you pressure both sides to actually move towards a solution? And European leaders that I've been meeting for the last year, invited to a lot of these roundtables, diplomats and leaders and officials, they all say it's only one thing that's going to end this war: stop the weapons. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It's as honest as that. But they say behind closed doors that, for example, 80% of European governments just are undisturbed and not very irritated enough to actually push Israel to end the war. They are okay with the war in Gaza continuing. They will continue to issue statements demanding a ceasefire, ending of hostilities, return of hostages, but they just want Israel to do whatever it wants to do, basically, as simple as that. And they admit behind closed doors. They say, we are completely irrelevant. We have let Gaza down. What makes it more painful is that once you sit with those people and they know the cameras are off, the mics are off, they would say as clear as possible, in no ambiguous terms, they would say what Israel is doing in Gaza is wiping out the place. It's making sure Gaza is going to be uninhabitable for the long-term future, not just the near future. Gaza is going to become uninhabitable. There is no ability to maintain organized human life in Gaza if the war ends today. One European leader, he even circled around the table his personal tablet and showed us satellite footage or imagery of what Israel has been doing to Gaza, neighborhood by neighborhood. And he said, look, Israel is systematically wiping out the place. So they acknowledge what is happening. And they know that Israel on the humanitarian front, one of them was jokingly saying that if we send a truck to Gaza with a tent that has the wrong color, so it's orange instead of green, Israel would turn back the whole convoy. They would not allow the truck to go in. They wouldn't just take that one tent out. And very clear, unambiguous on Israel deliberately engineering this starvation. But if you ask, what are you going to do about it? They say, don't ask us about anything other than humanitarian. We cannot do anything political. There's no willingness to do it. The only political thing that can be done is, as I said, stop the weapon supply to Israel at this moment. That's basic common sense.
Wow, thank you, Muhammad. Turning now to the question of reconstruction, just given everything that we heard, Muhammad Samhouri, I'd like to come back to you. As Muhammad just said, Israel is basically rendering Gaza uninhabitable. Do you share that view? Is Gaza a place where a critical mass of people can continue to live? I mean, we're seeing studies that suggest that it would take at least 8 years just to clear the rubble in Gaza, much less begin reconstruction. So how realistic is it that we can even have a reconstruction plan? Where should people go, or what should people do in the meantime? Are there ways to mitigate or prevent a kind of mass exodus after the war?
Well, okay, two things. One, given what happened in Gaza in terms of wholesale destruction over the past year, and what happened to the now 2.1 million people living there, struggling to survive basically under continued bombardment. Talk about reconstruction is not the issue here. I think the issue is how best we can provide the people in Gaza with a minimum amount of humanitarian aid, minimum level of basic services, water, electricity, fuel, education, health. Because that, I mean, these are people who have lost everything and in need for everything. And how can you make a bare minimum of commercial activities that can provide people with a modest income that enable them to survive? And to do all this in a situation where the future of Gaza is largely unknown in terms of political and in terms of security. So this is the issue here. I mean, we're not in 2008, 2009. We're not in 2014 type of reconstruction where the international community or donors gather in Sharm el-Sheikh or in Cairo making pledges and then start to get the reconstruction up and running. This is no longer the issue here, Khaled, and the rest of the panelists and audience. The issue is the situation. You have a situation where people living in utter despair. Were trained last week in Gaza, and in people who have been displaced multiple times, forcefully, I should add. Their conditions are really heartbreaking. This is the situation now. I'm not worried about reconstruction. As you mentioned, removing the rebels and the debris will probably take years under best conditions, provided that technical assistance is available and financial resources are available. This is not the issue anymore. The issue is how really to rescue, save the lives of the population in Gaza. This is the main question here. I listened to Joe and what he has mentioned. There are too many restrictions and too many obstacles, even to provide the population in Gaza with a bare minimum. The access, the inspection, the distribution, and then there is the issue of the breakdown, near total breakdown of law and order. It's catastrophic in every sense of the word. To follow up on what Muhammad has mentioned about the destruction of Gaza, looking at the satellite images, it's just shocking, the degree of destruction in Gaza from north to south, all the way. Latest I have is, I believe, July 2024. I mean, this is crazy. 70% of northern Gaza is destroyed. 74% of Gaza City is destroyed. 50% of Deir al-Balah is destroyed. Khan Yunis, 57%. Rafah, 43%. Add to this the environmental damage that the war has caused, the breakdown of the environmental management system that existed in Gaza before the war. So you have inability to deal with the trash and the garbage and the sewage and the solid waste and everything. People literally living among piles and piles of garbage and trash. There is, I believe, a report that came a couple months ago from the UN Environmental Program that details, shockingly, the nature of the problem there. Back to where I started, I mean, the issue here, I believe, is not reconstruction. We need to get our priorities right. The issue is to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe that currently exists in Gaza to provide people with the bare minimum of what they need in order to survive. Even if the war continues, because when the war ends, this is, I mean, nobody knows. But how to provide these people with what they need is the big question here. I hope this answered your question.
Yes, these are immensely huge issues that we're trying to grapple with. Tahani, I'd like to turn to you and maybe dig a little bit deeper. Last November, the Biden administration laid out its vision for post-war Gaza in Tokyo, which includes 6 principles. 1, that there would be no forcible displacement from Gaza. 2, no Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. 3, no reduction in Gaza's territory. 4, no blockade or siege on Gaza. And 5, Palestinian-led government under a unified PA in both Gaza and the West Bank. And lastly, some kind of sustained mechanism for Gaza reconstruction and rehabilitation. When we look at these parameters and compare them to the reality that exists today, are any of these even viable or realistic? Or have they been completely overtaken by events? In which case, what should happen next? How do you do what Mohammad Samhouri just laid out? How do you rescue the 2.1 million people who remain in Gaza and allow them to continue to live something resembling a dignified life?
Well, I mean, I think Mohammed Shahad is, outlining what was the kind of deal breaker in a lot of these latest rounds of ceasefire negotiations is pretty indicative that that's not where the Israeli line of thought is. And again, where US pressure is just simply absent in terms of getting Israel to take ceasefire negotiations seriously or even to engage with them in good faith. So realistically, I mean, look, I think there's always been this kind of again, schism between what Israel wants, what the Palestinians want, and what reality will ultimately allow. And right now, I mean, what you have is an incredibly divided front on the Palestinian side. You've got multiple post-stabilization plans coming from the US, which simply clashes with what Israel has already made very clear is a non-starter, which is the return of the PA, allowing any form of reconstruction of Gaza, especially any sort of entity that will ever, at least in the context of Gaza, threaten Israel's sense of security ever again, right? So now ultimately, I mean, unfortunately, what you have is an Israeli regime that is adamant. And I think in many ways, I think what we're seeing today is really an extension of Israel's policies towards Gaza since 2007, if not since the outset of the Israel-Palestine conflict, where they don't want Palestinians to have any permanence on the land. And that's very clear in the way that Israel talks about a kind of day after, right? Which is, effectively very maximalist. It appears that it wants the complete depopulation of Gaza, and it will continue to do whatever it can get away with to ensure that. What is abundantly clear, at least from the Israeli side, is that it's not going to allow Gaza to be rebuilt in any way that's fit for human habitation. I think the best we can hope for, even in the event of some kind of ceasefire, if that ever does come, at least for the short term, is a kind of tent city in the ruins, dependent on foreign aid for everything. And again, that can only change unless there's real pressure, on Israel from its Western allies. Now, to even think that the PA can feasibly take over Gaza, it's simply, I mean, realistically speaking, it just doesn't have the capacity to do that. It has neither the logistical capacity, which in many ways, has been abundantly clear over the last couple of years, where we've seen it lose so much control and legitimacy in the West Bank, where it is barely able to administer the very basics of administration. When you think about sanitation, education, and health, never mind security. And then you also have the fact that you are now in the midst of a succession battle in amongst the PA, right, where elites are far more interested now in self-aggrandizement than actually trying to push for any positive change for Palestinians, where the PA has been absolutely adamant on really not engaging in these sorts of ceasefire negotiations, where a lot of that has been relegated to Hamas. Even regional mediators will tell you that it's not that the PA didn't have an invitation to come to the negotiating table, it's that they refused to. The only people they wanted to deal with were the Americans, which were guaranteeing its survival, are still guaranteeing its survival. And then you also have the fact that, Israel has failed to qualify any of its military objectives on the ground. You still have Hamas that is in many ways intact as an administrative body as well as a military entity. And no body that is going to go into Gaza is going to be able to do so without incorporating or without the consent of groups like Hamas, which the Western international community, unlike the rest of the world, has already made clear is an absolute non-starter. So it really is very difficult to see how you can kind of reconcile all these sort of competing demands and visions, given what ultimately the reality is on the ground. But I think the most realistic outcome of all of this is, as I said, it is going to be the Israeli vision of ensuring, and again, this is unless the Western position or attitudes towards Palestinians changes, but ultimately it is unfortunately going to be a case where we see Gaza being reduced to a tent city.
Thanks, Tahani. Joe, I'd like to come back to you, since these are similar to issues that you've worked on in the past. According to a UN estimate from last May, it would cost at least around $30 billion to rebuild Gaza. Setting aside the question of, well, actually, maybe also tackle the question of how realistic that is. I mean, that number itself is almost certainly an underestimate. The damage compared to previous wars, like in 2014, is just exponentially higher. So assuming that this figure is some kind of a minimum of what would be required to begin the reconstruction process, how feasible is it that such funds can be raised in the international community, given that there's no will to stop the onslaught from now? Then what will there be to finance an even bigger problem later on? And also the question of where would these funds come from, assuming the World Bank would have some role, but mostly would come from donor countries. And do U.S. and Western nations have a special responsibility toward Gaza's post-war future, given the fact that they have largely financed Gaza's destruction? And finally, I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, but who would and should manage the reconstruction, or maybe something more modest, like just the stabilization effort in Gaza post-war?
Yeah, a lot of those are the big questions. First, I agree with virtually everything Tahani and Mohammed said prior to your questions to me, and that sets up this dilemma. First, on the funds, I think honestly the amount of money, whatever it might be, is not the main issue. And we also have to realize that even in the very best of circumstances, there's what we call absorptive capacity. That is, whatever some total number is thrown about, it's in a way irrelevant. The question is, what can you do in a particular year at a particular time with, and what does that cost? I think the mechanisms for mobilization and general control of that money in terms of financial institutions are well known. We've done many of them in other areas of combat. They can be adjusted for Gaza. We know the trust funds, we know the mechanics. The World Bank has excellent means of managing this. We come back to the other questions you asked, and that is, with who would be the counterpart? Let's imagine that there was a trust fund of X billion. With whom do they deal? To whom do they disperse? This is the question that is unanswered and very difficult. I want to come back because Mohammed raised the point, as did Tahani, which is, what do you do now? What is the day after? As I mentioned, if I just think about what happened, some of the things that I heard happening this morning, the day after could bring an enormous amount of chaos. It doesn't necessarily bring a sudden peace in Gaza with everyone smiling and throwing roses. Quite the contrary. You have the population without shelter, without nutrition, etc. They become desperate. And when people become desperate, they take up desperate means. So the question first is obviously physical security. And then you come down to, how do you stabilize? We heard on the trip I was on recently that Israel had what it called 3 channels for stabilization and humanitarian provision. First, military to military. And they've tested this a bit with the Jordanian corridor and with the American port and drops. As we all know, that's had some mixed success, but I think there is some room for what they consider to be the military channel for humanitarian goods. They consider a second channel to be what they call commercial, and commercial happens to favor, as you might guess, Israeli providers, Israeli trucks, and would be overseen by Israeli intelligence and Israeli military. The third channel they refer to as the humanitarian channel, which is the United Nations and other international and local NGOs and organizations. A good chunk, a good part of the present Israeli government refers to that channel as the Hamas channel. And this brings me to the questions I just saw in the chat, on which I'd like to address before coming back to trying to provide an answer. In the case of the trucks, the combination of the deconfliction, which has to some extent worked, and the understanding of the needs of the people has so far provided, at least I can speak for ANERA, we take great care to make sure that all of the goods reach the most vulnerable and those who need it. We do not provide and will not provide combatants with goods, and we have taken every measure to ensure that. How do our donors understand that? The question in the chat was, well, what do you do about convincing people outside Gaza? But we get that question all the time. One of the answers to that is, let the journalists come in. Gaza remains a kind of mass imprisonment camp. Let the journalists in. Let Europeans come. We're happy to have an observation. I'd be very happy if that, instead of Palestinians, those poor Palestinian guys in that first car, we had maybe some Europeans or somebody from the Gulf, and they could verify. I'd be very happy. And I assume and hope that they wouldn't be subject to drones and then immediate killing before asking questions. But there are ways to verify that the goods get to the right people. That's one. Number two, in the chat, there are some questions about what are Hamas's obligations under international humanitarian law, and implied in those questions are, what is the role of Hamas in the future? One, combatants, all combatants have a role and have obligations and should accept the constraints and limitations of international humanitarian law. The question with regard to the provision of goods and services to the most vulnerable in Gaza, whether Hamas is interfering or not, I can speak for the organization I understand, and I just did. Others can verify. I understand their concern. There are means of verification. As to hostages, well, this is something that is beyond anything I have understood. When I was in the West Bank and when we talked to our staff, and I understand there's at least one staff member of ANERA, there are over 10,000 Palestinians being held without charge, without access to their family. And we have staff people who are being held. We ask questions, why? We don't even get an answer to that. So those questions can be addressed to Hamas, but also to Israel. And that's where we come to the knot. Some kind of arrangement first for physical security that's acceptable and legitimate to the population is critical before we can even mobilize significant funding. And security is obviously first physical, and then we talk about social, health, education, and then we talk about economic, some kind of ability to have a livelihood. What does that mean in the short term? It obviously means that we need a system of governance which is accepted in the Palestinian population and which can provide, whether itself or through international or regional guarantees from neighboring nations, some guarantee that while, for example, many of the health workers, municipal workers, teachers, are deemed to be Hamas or affiliated with, but these are administrative people who run the system. There is no one else who has that capacity. Those people who run the civil systems need to continue. UNRWA needs to return in force. The issue really comes down to combatants and weapons, and that's a two-sided story. If you could find a system that would guarantee physical security, the rest of us who deal with economic and social security would be able to move. And I think there is verification. I can see a path forward. How long would this take and how much it would cost? We do have ideas. Could money be mobilized? The answer to all that is probably yes. It will take, but it takes time. The immediate question is how to prevent a further catastrophe from occurring, because we are on the brink of losing a whole generation of Gazans. Everyone under 15 suffering malnutrition. The children are suffering from, I'm talking about serious humanitarian issues. And I'm not talking about a few thousand, we're talking about hundreds of thousands. So there's a compelling need. And I would hope that all sides in this conflict would permit some, as I said, some kind of trusted force or observation at first, and then force to come in and provide at least the minimum amount of security upon which investments and maybe some reconstruction can occur. Once we have that, we know what to do.
Thanks, Joe. Part of the problem in what you just outlined is the Israeli military doesn't operate according to the same standard distinctions of combatants versus non-combatants. It rather talks about different categories of involved and uninvolved. And it deems people who are involved, and that is people who might be Hamas supporters or affiliates or even Hamas adjacent, to be considered involved. That could be aid workers, it could be first responders. So there are whole categories of people who we would consider civilians, but the Israeli military would consider legitimate targets because they are, quote, involved. So it's an entirely different standard, isn't it?
Yeah, let me give you an example. We had with us in our trip Yusuf Bashir, who wrote a book well received called Words of My Father. And Yusuf put some questions to certain people, and his mom and brother are still in Gaza, in Deir al-Balah. And it was very interesting. And his family must have 5,000 or more people. And he put an interesting question. He said, if let's say there were looters in our neighborhood and they attacked my house, and my brother comes out with a weapon to protect his mom in his house, not against IDF, but maybe just some local people, what happens? We got an answer. The answer was the drones will pick that up and he becomes a, quote, legitimate target. So yes, I use a micro example to illustrate exactly what you said. drones, I mean, we're entering also the rules of engagement in battle in which drones and people somewhere else are taking a look at what the drone sees. And in many cases that I've heard, simply because of a family name and a slight resemblance, and God knows all of us look like our relatives, huh? That gives a cause to make a fatal attack.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Joe. So we're gonna in a minute we're gonna turn to the whole idea of some kind of international presence. But before we do, I want to come back to Mohammed Shahade and ask you about setting aside all of the logistical or technical financial issues related to humanitarian or reconstruction, all of that. What does the day after look like in terms of governance and the political arrangements on the internal Palestinian side? I think the one thing virtually everyone seems to agree on, Israel, the PA, the US, even Hamas, is that Hamas will not govern Gaza after whenever this war ends, as it did before October 7th. So who or what is going to govern Gaza? In Beijing, the Palestinian factions agreed on the creation of some kind of consensus government to operate in both the West Bank and Gaza. And that seems very pie in the sky at the moment. But what needs to happen on the internal Palestinian political front to unlock some of these Gordian knots or untie some of these Gordian knots that would even allow for rehabilitation or significant humanitarian aid, much less reconstruction, to happen? Is reconciliation required between Hamas and Fatah, or is it possible to circumvent that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have Hamas realizing that they cannot stay in government. A decade ago, 2014 was the peak of it, in which they disbanded their own cabinet, the ministerial cabinet, and told the Palestinian Authority, you can come over and take over the place. It was a conditional disbanding of the government at the time. It was conditioned on the PA merging Hamas's civil servants. A lot of them are not even affiliated with Hamas, but worked in its government, merging them with the Palestinian Authority personnel, because those are the people that have been running Gaza for about 80 years at the time, and now for 18 years. And the other condition was that the security force in Gaza will not collaborate with Israel, will not provide intelligence on armed resistance or armed activities. And there was the condition of joining the PLO. At the time, Mahmoud Abbas was in a way accepting that arrangement, 2014. What you saw at that point is a response from both Israel and the US that was directed explicitly at sabotaging this reconciliation. So for Israel, Saeb Erekat said at the time that when we negotiate with the Israelis, they say you don't have a mandate all over all of Palestine because you're not running Gaza. As soon as we made that agreement with Hamas, the Israeli delegation left the table and said, well, you're now in a partnership with Hamas. We cannot talk to you anymore. And it's the same for the Americans. They say that if you merge a single Hamas person in the security forces of the PA, you're not going to get any funding for the security forces. It's the same. I even have a friend who used to work as a liaison between the Americans and the Palestinian Authority. And he told me explicitly, he said one of his main jobs was to consistently undermine Palestinian reconciliation. Every time there is a talk of it, a breakthrough, he would get a call from the Americans telling him, go and ruin it today. Go talk to Abbas, to people in the Palestinian Authority, bring it down. So for a whole decade, you had this apparatus where Hamas and Fatah, they would hold rounds of talks all over the globe. They even considered moving the talks to Mars because they ran out of countries to meet in. They met in Lebanon, in South Africa, in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Egypt, in all over the map. Even in Nigeria, I think at some point, if I'm not mistaken. And none of it happened. So for that whole decade of it being constantly sabotaged, now you have a totally different picture of Hamas being heavily invested in not running Gaza because they understand as long as they remain in government, it'll be used as a convenient pretext to continue to starve the population, to maintain the siege on Gaza. Whereas having an internationally recognized government running the place, it might give a little more breakthrough to the population. It would not remove the siege, but it would improve it to some extent. Because Israel's siege on Gaza, it was in place when the PA was there. It was in place in the 90s, and with the disengagement. So you can read an article in the New York Times, 1995, I think, in which the headline was "Palestinians Learn Freedom Has Its Limits." And the most resonant word in that article, 1995, was open air prison about Gaza. That was 2 years after the grand peace agreement. So the blockade was there when the PA is there. But if it comes back, there is at least understanding that it would get more funding. It would open up the place a little bit. It would run the borders, so that might ease the situation in some regards. And now Hamas has a vested interest in having the PA run the place in order for reconstruction to go as fast as possible, because otherwise they understand people will sort of hold a lot of grudges against them. So in that regard, you are at a situation now where Hamas is saying, come and take the place with a technocratic government, with a PA government, as long as it's on one condition, that it's unanimously chosen by Palestinians, not imposed by Israel or the Americans or the Europeans or the Emiratis or the Qataris, a Palestinian chosen government. And if you want to propose Muhammad Mustafa as the prime minister, they could play along with that, as long as there is factional Palestinian consensus, as long as Palestinian political parties agree to that person. The only problem there is that Israel is saying, no, the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to come back and run the place. They're not allowed into Gaza. They will not be given a foothold in it. So that creates this sort of like impossible deadlock. The other problem is that Mahmoud Abbas understands if Hamas were to join the PLO, it would be immediately sanctioned, the whole organization, the whole entity, and it would open the ground for the Israeli government that has been repeatedly saying they have a vested interest in collapsing the PA. It would give them a convenient pretext to collapse it at once. So he is afraid at the same time of any sort of even meeting with Hamas in public, because it would be used against him. In that situation, what would be needed is basically to have people pressure Israel as much as possible to reconsider the idiotic plans that they have in place for Gaza's day after. I heard it from senior former Israeli politicians who would beg the Europeans, literally beg, and I use that word carefully, not polemically. They would beg the Europeans behind closed doors. They would say the IDF are forced to come up with lunatic plans by the morning, and the same IDF generals that make these plans know that it's lunatic, and they would be the ones leaking to the media and criticizing it in Israeli media to undermine it, because they know it's not going to work as long as Netanyahu has the veto on a Palestinian Authority running Gaza. So, for example, you have Israel considering arming families in Gaza, and that has been something that they have already initiated and started, talking to gangs or large tribes in Gaza, as they call it, tribal leaders, although that sounds like something from colonial Congo, but they have been in touch with a lot of these families that resent Hamas and have been sort of giving them a lot of privileges, a lot of promises, and potentially arming some of them, because as Joe said, you cannot raise a knife in Gaza in public without a drone picking it up and rendering you a target. But there were a lot of people in Deir al-Balah, for example, that walked and paraded around the streets with M16 rifles, American rifles that are not in position, that Hamas is not in possession of, freshly new, that mysteriously landed in their arms without any Israeli drones picking them up, without anyone targeting them. But that plan, it ends with a simple phone call from a Hamas member to one of these families saying, if you run along with Israel's plan, you're going to get shot. And that blows up the whole thing. I do this painful exercise of reading every single Israeli newspaper every day, twice, once in the morning, in the evening. It's very boring, very tedious. But you see Israelis admitting the tribal families plan is not working. They're not cooperating with us. This other plan of bringing a Palestinian entity of businessmen is not working. So all the alternatives are not happening. The only alternative that you have there is a Netanyahu Israeli government vested interest in not having anyone run Gaza to maintain that state of collapse. After every war that Israel launched on Gaza, I lived through 10 Israeli military operations, 3 wars, and 2 grand invasions. That's how people in Gaza measure our age. And after every war of these, there was about a flood of people leaving that would amount to something like 50,000 at most, maybe 100,000 after 2014 as maximum estimate. Up until October 7th, you had 250,000 Gazans that left. But now after this war, Israel wants to maintain a situation of chaos. As I mentioned earlier, they perfected the art of starvation in a way, and the art of destruction in a way that prevents organized human life from existing in Gaza now, or if the war ends, for many years to come. So, for example, with starvation, you no longer see Israelis saying we're sort of banning all food from coming into Gaza. But the police and the military would inform Israeli settlers and right-wing extremists that there is a truck going to Gaza at this hour on this route. Go and disturb it. Go and sabotage it. That's the Jerusalem Post reporting on that. After that truck, if it miraculously reaches the borders without being sabotaged and looted by Israeli extremists at the border, they would turn the whole thing back if there is one nail clipper in it, as Joe said. But if that truck succeeds to pass the examination, Israel orders it to unload all of its containers, all of its merchandise on the Gazan side of the border and leave, not to go inside Gaza, and wait for a truck from Gaza itself to come and pick it up. I'm wrapping with half a sentence, to come and pick it up. But in that instance, once the truck comes to take it throughout Gaza, it is undermined either by IDF operations or IDF systematic targeting of law and order officials in Gaza to allow looting, as well as tolerating the smuggling of cigarettes in some of these trucks. If they can turn back a whole truck because of a nail clipper, but somehow some cigarettes make its way into Gaza, along with Israel throwing cigarettes on people's head with a pamphlet that says, collaborate with us and you will get more, at a time where a single cigarette in Gaza cost about 200 shekels, $50 US. That is a deliberate incentive for people to come and loot these trucks to find this hidden gold, basically.
Thanks, Mohammed. Sorry to rush you, but we are really short on time. We have about 14 minutes left and a whole round of questions to get to all four of you. So I'm going to ask you, we're going to do a lightning round. I want to ask you about the idea of an international presence. I'm going to ask you each to take, please, no more than 3 minutes each. I know it's asking a lot, but I'm going to ask you essentially the same question. There are lots of different proposals out there for an international mechanism that will deal with Gaza post-war in some capacity. Sometimes people talk about a multinational force in the traditional sense. Some people are talking about a UN trusteeship. Some are talking about an interim transitional authority of some kind. How feasible are these different models? Is one more feasible than the other? A second part of that question is, where is the Palestinian governance component in those models? The Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, recently put out their own proposal for the day after that doesn't include any kind of international presence. So how will that work? And lastly, what should the role of Arab states in particular be in these kinds of mechanisms, since we're hearing from many Arab states that they're not actually going to put boots on the ground or put themselves in a position where they're the subcontractors for Israel's occupation. So I'm going to start with Tahani. And again, if you could do, please, 3 minutes each.
So look, on a technical level, there have been over 1 million plans, as you've just outlined, and a lot of them are very ill thought out and quite ad hoc proposals. A lot of these are also coming from Israel that wants basically the international community to foot a bill of over $80 billion that basically dances to the tune of the Israelis. But the few viable proposals that have come out are absolutely, there isn't even a will to implement them, but never mind that, they're immediately shut down. Some of those do include things like a United Nations Security Council Chapter 7 mission, where executive authority would be relegated to the UN. That has immediately been shut down, especially by Israel's allies, on the basis of it being too political. The idea of Palestinians putting forward their own proposal, a lot of the times they often tend to be excluded in these rooms where these formulations for the day after are being put together. And where they are sort of being incorporated, it's very much proposals that are being imposed on the Palestinians in terms of their roles. But in many cases, what is being floated around is completely ad hoc, not really coordinated with the different stakeholders involved, which is making them even less feasible in terms of implementations. But I think the more pressing issue here is that ultimately, it's not really who has the legitimacy or what the mandate will be, but the danger that any kind of peacekeeping force that could be implemented in a day after will effectively be called upon to help Israel police its ongoing de facto occupation of the Strip. And that is what many of these proposals are basically putting forward. They are effectively security solutions to what amount to political problems. Whether you're talking about solutions coming from the Western international community, regional states, or even the Palestinian Authority itself. And so I think that is something to seriously consider when we talk about these sorts of day after plans and what mechanisms and who should create them.
Thanks, Tahani. Mohammed Zamhouri, the same set of questions to you about international presence.
So far, we have a large number of so-called day after plans, and none of them so far have been credible enough to be chosen by who, I don't know, to run Gaza, assuming that there is a day after. The situation again is very chaotic, and the potential of becoming more chaotic is there. We still don't know when the war will end, how it will end, and what kind of Gaza that will emerge in the immediate aftermath of this war. Gaza currently is under complete Israeli control. But this is an international, should be of international concern. It's not enough for the international community to call for or whoever is interested from the international community to call for a ceasefire. The main issue here is what will happen once this ceasefire, assuming that someday we'll get it, will happen. There is a transition period. There is a catastrophic situation in Gaza, and the issue of governance and law and order and administration that is capable of providing services to the extremely exhausted and extremely traumatized population. This is the main issue here. I really don't know an answer to the question who will run Gaza, and but this should be an issue of immediate and utmost concern for the international community. It should not be left to a country X, Y, or Z alone. It should not be left to bandits or experts. Of course, I mean, international experience can provide guidance on what to do in post-conflict management. But as I said in a piece that currently I'm writing, Gaza is a special case, handle with care case. And if it is bungled, the consequences of this mismanagement will be with us for years to come. How to handle it is the big question now.
Thank you, Mohammed. Mohammed Shehadeh, I'm going to ask you the same set of questions about international presence. And if you could touch on specifically where the Palestinian leadership fits into this equation.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically now you have Israel for almost a year failing catastrophically at eliminating Hamas or dismantling its governing structures as a minimum or disarming it. So what Hamas is saying, as well as other Palestinian political parties, is we will not allow anyone to come to Gaza and try to do the job that Israel failed to accomplish. As you said, to be Israel's subcontractor, to go and do intelligence gathering, disarmament, dismantling of armed structures, tunnels, etc., to go and do spying, sniff into people's trash, and impose restrictions on people in Gaza and be basically Israel's occupation with a different uniform. Hamas says that this is a guaranteed recipe for us to be hostile to any international presence, that even if it's the Palestinian Authority, they would be hostile to the Palestinian Authority if it tries to do the job that Israel failed to accomplish. That's basically the very basic message. It's the same even for the population in Gaza. If you put an occupying force, that's what an international mission would be, as playing a security role would be understood as. If you put an occupying force in Gaza to impose Israel's restrictions and to do its bidding, with a population that's been suffering a genocide, a prolonged genocide for a year, you have a guarantee from people from Gaza, everyone young or old, to be hostile to that international force. At the same time, if the international force is coming to Gaza to do reconstruction, to to enforce the ceasefire, to make sure there's not going to be hostilities, to maintain a buffer area, to document, to report on the situation there, on who's violating the ceasefire agreement, that is more than welcome for anyone to come, whether the Emirates, Qatar, Japan. I met the Japanese envoy to the Middle East peace. He was interested in the idea. Anyone at all that's willing to play that role, they would welcome it. Before this war happened, there was even an Israeli philanthropist that donated some water purification machines to the Rantisi hospital in Gaza, named after a very senior Hamas leader and co-founder. Hamas accepted it without any objections. If anyone, for example, Egypt as a central player, Jordan as well, if they would be coming into Gaza themselves and putting men on the ground to do the reconstruction, the rubble removal, enforcing the ceasefire, assisting with law and order, that would be more than welcome. The red line is anyone at all, even Palestinian or foreign, that will try to come and do Israel's bidding.
Thanks. Joe, you're going to have the last word. And if I could add a different dimension, an additional dimension to the question about the international presence, could such an international mechanism also be responsible for not just for humanitarian or reconstruction, but also the question of accountability? We now have these major cases in the International Court of Justice and the ICC, but can there be an enforcement component? Can there be an accountability component for the many atrocities that we've seen over the last year?
You know, thanks. I don't have an answer either to the ultimate governance, but I'd like to come back to the first point I made, which is on the international humanitarian law. We would like to see a return of the rule of law, a recognition by all the parties here involved, in Hamas and Israel and others, at least to adhere to the laws which they have signed. We face a very serious, in the case of Gaza, we face a very serious eroding of a whole system of law that's been built up since the time I was born, 75 years this year. The first commitment we could get is to that. What does that mean? Okay, that would mean, as I mentioned, I don't want to even call it a force to begin the transition that Mohammed is talking about. I would call it an inquiry. I pulled a book off my shelf called A Survey of Palestine, prepared in December 45 and January 46 for the information of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. We could argue about whether anything came of that. However, that model presents an interesting possibility for the beginning of a transition. That is, we bring in journalists, we bring in people who can, as you said, bear witness to what is happening and also assure that we could get our humanitarian and early development goods in, and that we can begin to establish and reestablish governance at least for health and for education. I think that is possible. It does not solve some of the bigger questions that you have all addressed. And Mohammed Shahada's questions are difficult. But at least as far as the areas that ANERA works in, this kind of activity would move the needle quite a bit to alleviate in the near term the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I would like to think avoid what I fear is a serious coming chaos in addition to the humanitarian disaster.
Yeah, I think that's the fear that we all have, and it sort of boggles the mind that there are folks, presumably reasonable people, who imagine that all of this death and destruction will somehow make anyone safe. It's truly astonishing. In any case, I want to thank you all for a really, really rich discussion. I know we only just scratched the surface, but thank you to Hani Mustafa, Joe Saba, Mohammed Samhouri, Mohammed Shahadi for joining in this discussion. We hope to have you back for future events, and thank you all to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, Khaled, for being a good moderator.
Thank you very much, Khaled, and to all who attended and all the other panelists. We all hope that these kinds of events will at least begin some steps that have become constructive.
Thank you.
Thank you all.